The story opens with the sky stretching endlessly above, painted in shades of steel gray as the morning sun breaks through thin clouds. Below, the rumble of engines grows louder, the kind of sound that shakes the ground and rattles the chest of anyone standing nearby. It is the sound of America's Air Force preparing to take flight, each machine brimming with promise and danger. In the early Cold War years, these takeoffs were not routine exercises, they were declarations of strength. Every roar of a jet into the sky carried a message that echoed across borders. The United States was ready, and nothing could stand in its way. In those tense years after the Second World War, the world was split into two spheres of power. The Soviet Union had risen as a formidable rival, and every nation watched carefully to see which side would falter first. For America, the answer lay in the skies. If the oceans had once protected the nation, the skies now became the shield and sword. The early context of this story is rooted in that simple truth, that the battle for influence in the Cold War would not be fought only on the ground, but far above the clouds. Imagine standing at an air base during one of those defining mornings. The crisp air carried the smell of fuel and oil, a sharp reminder of the machinery that made such power possible. Crews moved quickly along the runways, their movements precise and purposeful, as if every second mattered. The pilots, often younger than they appeared, carried the weight of history on their shoulders. Behind their calm expressions was the knowledge that each mission might test the limits of human endurance, and each return to the runway was not guaranteed. The early context of the Air Force's rise was not just about machines, but about symbolism. These flights were more than training, they were performances on a world stage. When a jet streaked across the horizon, it was not simply a machine defying gravity, it was a nation announcing its resolve. At home, citizens listened to radio reports or read headlines about the boldness of their airmen, and many felt a surge of pride. Abroad, rivals and allies alike measured every maneuver, knowing that these displays were signals of intent. The Cold War magnified every action, and even the simplest demonstration became a strategic weapon. A flight across vast distances was more than a technical feat. It was a reminder that no corner of the globe was beyond America's reach. Each successful operation built confidence within the nation, but it also placed pressure on the Air Force to prove itself again and again. In this environment, there was no room for failure, because failure would mean weakness in the eyes of the world. The early years became a crucible, shaping the Air Force into the symbol of unstoppable power it would soon become. Yet this context was fragile, as it rested on the razor's edge of perception. A nation's belief in its superiority could rise or fall with the outcome of a single mission. That was the burden carried by every pilot, every mechanic, every commander. The world did not see the exhaustion, the sleepless nights, the tension that lingered in silence before takeoff. What they saw was the image of strength, a nation whose wings stretched farther and faster than any other. This image, carefully built and fiercely defended, was the foundation for the story that would unfold. At its core, the early context is a story of ambition colliding with fear. America's Air Force had to rise to the challenge of proving itself, not in the pages of strategy books, but in the skies where mistakes could not be hidden. The tension of those first missions captured the imagination of millions and set the tone for decades to follow. This was the beginning of a narrative that would show how courage, technology, and determination combined into a force that redefined power itself. It was here, in those first moments of takeoff, that the legend of America's unstoppable Air Force was born. Yet, behind the rising pride and bold declarations, a darker reality loomed. For every takeoff that stirred confidence, there were questions whispered in strategy rooms and in the halls of government. Could the United States really sustain this level of dominance in the air, or was it an illusion waiting to be shattered? Rivals across the world believed that America's reach was overstated, that distance, fatigue, and technology would eventually betray the image of invincibility. Even within America itself, voices of doubt emerged. suggesting that the Air Force was attempting to promise more than it could deliver. For the airmen, this conflict was not abstract. It was lived with every mission. They understood the fragility of machines pushed to their breaking point. Engines overheated, wings trembled under high speeds, and fuel burned faster than calculations sometimes allowed. The contrast between the vision of unstoppable might and the reality of fragile machinery was stark. Pilots carried this knowledge into the cockpit, knowing that the world might see only the triumphant flight, while they lived the uncertainty of survival. Imagine being one of those pilots, strapped tightly into the seat, helmet pressed against the canopy glass as the roar of engines vibrated through your bones. Outwardly, you represented strength and certainty, but inside, you felt the gnawing awareness of risk. Every minute in the sky was a balancing act between human endurance and mechanical strain. The contrast was undeniable. To the outside world, these missions looked effortless, yet to those who flew them, each second was a reminder of vulnerability. The Soviet Union, watching carefully, seized on these doubts. Its leaders claimed that American superiority was temporary, that endurance would falter, and that no machine could dominate forever. Propaganda emphasized every mechanical failure, every aborted mission as proof that the Air Force's image was built on fragile foundations. To the Soviet audience, the message was clear. American claims of supremacy were exaggerated, and time would expose the truth. This conflict of perception was as critical as any battle fought in the skies. But the challenge was not only external. Within the American government, officials weighed the enormous cost of maintaining air dominance. Resources were stretched, budgets tested, and critics questioned whether this pursuit of global reach was sustainable. Each debate in Washington echoed with urgency because behind the numbers and reports lay a simple fact. If the Air Force faltered, the nation's credibility faltered with it. The struggle was not just about aircraft. It was about identity. Could America truly live up to the image it was projecting to the world? For the airmen, these debates were distant, yet their consequences were deeply personal. Every mission carried the pressure of proving not just their own courage, but the worth of the entire Air Force. Failure meant more than personal loss. It meant confirming the doubts of rivals and critics alike. The conflict between perception and reality hung heavy in the air, and every flight was a gamble played on the world stage. The contrast between ambition and uncertainty defined the era, creating a constant tension that pushed the Air Force to the very edge of possibility. It was within this fragile balance that the true drama of the story unfolded. America's Air Force was caught between two worlds, the polished image of unstoppable power and the harsh reality of risk, danger, and doubt. The tension was unrelenting, yet it was also transformative. Out of this conflict grew the determination to prove that nothing could stop them. It was this very contrast between what was believed and what was real that set the stage for the Air Force's greatest triumphs. The origins of this story reach back to the turbulent aftermath of World War II. In those final years of the global conflict, American air power had played a decisive role, delivering blows that crippled enemy industry and broke the will of opposing armies. Yet the world that emerged from the ruins of 1945 was not one of peace, but one of uneasy rivalry. The United States and the Soviet Union stood as two superpowers, each wary of the other, each determined to shape the future. For America, the question became clear. How could it extend the lessons of wartime into a new era defined not by battles already fought, but by threats looming just over the horizon? From these questions, the United States Air Force, as we know it, was born. In 1947, it became an independent branch of the military, no longer confined under the Army's command, but standing on its own as the guardian of the skies. This independence was not simply organizational, it was symbolic. It declared to the world that America understood air power as the decisive frontier of modern conflict. The planes that had once been tools of war were now instruments of strategy, diplomacy, and deterrence. This was a new vision, one that demanded not only technology, but also an identity forged in ambition. The Air Force inherited the machines and men who had proven themselves in World War II, but the challenges they now faced were different. The globe was larger in scope, and the enemy was no longer bound to familiar battlefields. Distance itself became the opponent, and endurance became the measure of victory. Aircraft had to fly farther than ever before, pilots had to survive longer missions, and crews had to master conditions that stretched human limits. The sky was no longer a stage for battle alone. It was the arena where nations measured their very existence. Imagine the workshops and hangars of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Engineers bent over blueprints, their pencils scratching as they calculated fuel ratios, wing stress, and new propulsion systems. The smell of metal, oil, and sweat filled the air as prototypes were assembled under bright lights that burned through long nights. Every rivet hammered into place was not just part of a machine, but part of a promise. Each completed aircraft was more than a weapon. It was a statement. America was willing to invest its brilliance and its industry into mastering the skies. At the same time, the airmen themselves were being reshaped by the mission. Training intensified, hours grew longer, and expectations soared higher. Pilots learned not just how to fly, but how to endure the strain of missions that tested body and mind alike. Instructors drilled into them that they were not only warriors, but also representatives of a nation's strength. Every flight became a test, every landing a reminder that they carried more than their own lives in the cockpit. They carried the credibility of the United States, balanced on wings of metal and fire. The origins of America's unstoppable Air Force were also deeply rooted in psychology. Leaders knew that machines alone could not secure dominance. Perception was just as important as capability. Demonstrations, parades, and publicized missions served as both reassurance to citizens and warning to rivals. The Air Force became a symbol of innovation and resilience, embodying the belief that progress itself could serve as a shield. In this way, origins were not merely technical, but cultural. They shaped how Americans saw themselves and how the world saw them. By the early 1950s, the Air Force stood as more than a branch of the military. It was the embodiment of an idea. That idea was simple, yet powerful. No challenge was too great, no distance too far, and no rival too strong. Out of the ashes of World War II and into the shadows of the Cold War, the Air Force carried forward not just lessons of history, but the determination to lead the future. Its origins were forged in ambition, sharpened by necessity, and sealed by the belief that the skies belonged to America. When the first true tests of America's new air power came, the results echoed far beyond the sound of engines overhead. The Air Force was called upon not to theorize, but to act, and in those moments the stakes became real. Missions stretched across great distances, sometimes pushing machines to the very limits of their endurance. Pilots learned what it meant to balance exhaustion with precision, to fly not only against the wind, but against the doubts of those who believed the mission could not be done. Each successful flight was not just a technical victory, it was a declaration that America's Air Force could achieve what others had dismissed as impossible. The battlefield was no longer confined to narrow fronts. It stretched across oceans, deserts, and mountains, demanding presence where few thought aircraft could sustain themselves. Imagine the roar of jet engines cutting through the silence of the night, their afterburners casting streaks of light against the dark sky. To those on the ground, the sight and sound were unforgettable, a reminder that the Air Force could arrive at any hour in any place. For enemies, it was a haunting reality, forcing them to consider that the skies were never truly theirs. For allies, it was reassurance that American power was not a promise, but a presence. The impact of these missions was measured in more than just miles traveled or bombs delivered. They reshaped strategy itself. Commanders on the battlefield began to plan with the assumption that American air power would be there to tip the balance. This was a dramatic shift, as battles could be influenced or even decided before soldiers on the ground exchanged fire. The mere knowledge that jets could appear from the horizon at any moment changed how enemies defended and how allies advanced. Air dominance did not just alter tactics, it transformed the psychology of war. For the pilots and crews, the battlefield impact was personal and immediate. They lived with the pressure of knowing that their success or failure could shape the course of entire campaigns. Imagine sitting in a cockpit, thousands of feet above the earth, where every decision had consequences far beyond the clouds. A moment of hesitation or error could cost not just a mission, but the confidence of a nation. Conversely, each precise maneuver, each successful strike, and each safe return was proof that the Air Force was more than equal to its task. These experiences forged bonds among airmen who came to see themselves as guardians of a legacy greater than any single mission. The enemies of the United States began to understand the impact in their own terms. Defensive strategies that had once seemed sufficient were now inadequate. Anti-aircraft systems, supply lines, and command posts were all suddenly vulnerable in ways they had not been before. Leaders who once boasted of resilience found themselves recalculating, recognizing that the air was no longer neutral space. It belonged to those who could dominate it, and increasingly, it belonged to America. This realization spread fear and uncertainty across enemy ranks, undermining morale before a shot was fired. On the other side, America's allies felt the impact as a shield. Nations that feared being left alone against aggression looked up to the sky and saw not only planes, but also promises fulfilled. The presence of American jets overhead was a message that their defense was secure, that they would not stand isolated in the face of danger. The battlefield was no longer measured only in territory gained or lost, but also in confidence restored. For smaller nations especially, the sight of American air power meant that they were not forgotten, that they stood within the reach of a protector whose strength seemed limitless. The battlefield was changed forever by these missions. No longer was war confined to trenches and front lines. With every successful operation, the Air Force redefined what conflict meant in the modern age. Its impact was not fleeting, but enduring, as the lessons of those flights rippled into strategy, diplomacy, and global perception. The skies had become the true battlefield, and America's ability to master them ensured that no enemy could ignore the reality of its power. In this way, the Air Force proved not only its strength, but also its indispensability to the defense of freedom itself. The consequences of America's rise to air supremacy were felt far beyond the runways and cockpits. Each successful mission was not only a tactical achievement, but also a message sent to the rest of the world. For allies, it was reassurance that the United States could and would defend them if threatened. For adversaries, it was a sobering reminder that the skies no longer belonged to them. The power to reach across continents and strike with precision became both a shield and a warning, reshaping the way nations viewed war and peace. Diplomatic halls across Europe and Asia began to echo with the effects of these demonstrations. Leaders who once doubted America's willingness to commit were reassured by the thunder of jets overhead. Meetings with American officials carried greater weight because behind every handshake stood the image of an air force that could cross oceans in hours. For smaller nations especially, American air power was more than a military tool, it was a guarantee of survival. It meant that aggression would not go unanswered, that there was a global power capable of standing watch. For the United States itself, the consequences were complex. Success brought pride and unity, but it also created a burden. Once America proved it could dominate the skies, there was no turning back. The public expected continued supremacy, and rivals expected continued displays of power. Each mission raised the stakes, creating a cycle in which triumph had to be followed by even greater triumphs. Failure was not an option, because failure would erode the image of invincibility carefully constructed by blood, sweat, and ingenuity. The psychological effects were as important as the military ones. Enemies began to calculate their moves differently, knowing that air dominance could disrupt their plans before they even began. The mere sound of jets in the distance could scatter troops or disrupt supply lines. At the same time, soldiers on the ground fighting alongside American forces drew courage from the knowledge that they were not alone. To them, the skies above were a constant reminder of support, a presence that turned fear into resolve. Within Washington, leaders wrestled with the broader implications. Air supremacy meant that the United States was no longer just a participant in world affairs, but a guardian of the global order. With that role came responsibility, and with responsibility came cost. Budgets swelled, factories expanded, and thousands of workers poured their labor into keeping the Air Force at the edge of possibility. The wider consequences of success were not simply measured in victory, but also in the resources and sacrifices required to sustain it. Imagine the effect on the average citizen at home. Newspapers carried headlines about daring flights and bold demonstrations. Families looked skyward when jets thundered past, proud yet also aware of the weight that rested on their nation. For many, these displays became part of a new identity, one that tied American freedom to American dominance of the skies. The Air Force was no longer just a military branch, it was a symbol of the nation itself, embodying resilience, ambition, and promise. The wider consequences extended even into the realm of imagination. Artists, filmmakers, and writers drew upon the image of soaring jets and unstoppable strength to craft stories that captured the spirit of the age. The Air Force became a cultural touchstone, its power shaping not only strategy, but also the way Americans thought about themselves and their role in the world. Its reach was not confined to air bases or battlefields. It permeated into every corner of society, reminding all who saw or heard of it that America's power had taken flight. The moment of climax did not arrive in a single instant, but through a series of undeniable triumphs that silenced skeptics once and for all. Each mission, each demonstration, built upon the last until the evidence became overwhelming. The doubts that once hung over the Air Force like storm clouds began to fade, replaced by awe at what was being achieved. Against distance, against danger, and against fear itself, the Air Force proved unstoppable. It was no longer a question of whether America could dominate the skies, but how far it could go in defining the very future of warfare. Imagine being a rival commander, watching reports come in of flights that spanned continents, of missions carried out with precision that seemed impossible only a few years earlier. What could once be dismissed as propaganda now appeared as fact, undeniable and unshakable. The world's balance of power shifted in the silence of stunned war rooms and the anxious faces of adversaries who realized that their defenses could be outflanked from above. The skies were no longer neutral, they were controlled, and that control belonged to the United States. For the airmen themselves, the climax was lived in sweat, exhaustion, and relief. Pilots stumbled out of cockpits after missions that pushed body and machine beyond what had been thought possible. Their faces were lined with fatigue, their uniforms stained with the smell of fuel and the weight of hours in the air. Yet in their eyes burned the knowledge that they had proven something extraordinary. They had not only met the challenge, they had redefined what was achievable. Every successful return to the runway was both survival and victory. The climax also unfolded in the minds of American citizens. For years, they had been told of their Air Force's potential, but now they could see its power with their own eyes. Parades of jets across city skies, headlines of daring feats, and broadcasts of triumphant missions painted a clear picture. America was not only safe, it was unmatched. The pride of the nation swelled with every demonstration, weaving the Air Force into the very fabric of national identity. It was more than protection. It was proof of American resilience and determination. In Washington, leaders who had once faced criticism now stood emboldened. The gamble had paid off, and the Air Force had become the crown jewel of America's strategic power. Plans were drawn with greater confidence, knowing that behind every policy stood the reach of air supremacy. Rivals could challenge the United States in words, but not in the skies. In the tense chess game of the Cold War, the Air Force had become the piece that changed the board entirely. The climax of this story was not a single battle won or a single mission completed. But the moment when perception itself shifted. What had been doubted was now proven. What had been questioned was now accepted. The unstoppable reputation of America's Air Force was no longer an aspiration. It was a reality. The world had seen it, and the world could not unsee it. In that defining period, the Air Force secured a place not just in military strategy, but in history itself, as the force that showed nothing could stand in its way. The legacy of America's unstoppable Air Force was not confined to the years when it first proved its strength. It stretched forward through decades, shaping the way the world understood power, freedom, and security. Once the Air Force had shown its ability to dominate the skies, it could never again return to being a mere branch of the military. It had become a symbol, a force that carried the weight of national identity and global influence. The sound of its engines, the sight of its contrails stretching across the horizon, became a constant reminder that America's reach was both vast and unchallenged. For adversaries, the legacy was a sobering reality. No matter how they sought to counter or diminish America's achievements, the proof of air supremacy stood inescapable. Every future strategy, every new weapon, had to be measured against the benchmark the Air Force had set. The skies were no longer contested ground, but terrain defined by American dominance. Rivals could not erase the psychological scar of realizing that distance and defense offered little protection from a force that could arrive anywhere, at any time. For allies, the legacy carried a different meaning. The United States became not only a military partner, but also a guarantor of survival. Nations who once feared isolation drew confidence from the knowledge that American air power would be there in moments of crisis. Diplomatic relationships deepened, not because of promises written on paper, but because of the thunder of jets that had proven their reliability. This trust became one of America's most powerful tools, binding nations together under the assurance that the skies were guarded. At home, the legacy transformed how Americans viewed themselves. Citizens no longer saw their nation as simply protected by oceans and borders, but as a power whose reach spanned the globe. The Air Force became part of everyday imagination, appearing in news, in culture, and in the national consciousness. Children looked up at the roar of jets overhead and felt pride, knowing their country commanded the air. Families who read headlines of daring missions felt both reassured and inspired. In this way, the Air Force's triumph became woven into the story of American resilience and ambition. The legacy also carried responsibility. Once supremacy had been demonstrated, it demanded to be maintained. This meant years of investment, innovation, and sacrifice. Factories continued to build, engineers continued to push limits, and airmen continued to train for missions that would stretch them to their limits. The weight of this legacy was heavy, but it also ensured that progress never stopped. The determination to remain unstoppable became part of the Air Force's very identity, a cycle of ambition that fueled the next generation. Looking back, the moment when America's Air Force proved nothing could stop them was more than a historical episode. It was a turning point that defined the balance of the Cold War, reshaped military strategy, and altered global expectations. It showed that courage, combined with innovation and relentless will, could redefine what was possible. The skies became not only a battlefield, but also a stage upon which America declared its role in history. The closing chapter of this story is not one of endings, but of endurance. The legacy lives on in every aircraft that takes flight, in every pilot who carries the burden of history, and in every moment the world looks skyward and remembers. America's Air Force did not merely prove its strength, it proved a truth that became eternal, that with vision and a determination, nothing could stop them. This was not just victory in the air, it was victory in the story of humanity's struggle for freedom and power.